Now, in the first episode on the fall of Libya, we examined Libya's very first institution, which was the monarchy constitution, a superstructure without the necessary substructure. For example, the superstructure that was there was parliament, but the substructure which wasn't there were strong political parties to at least make the system a lot more stable. Now, when King Idris leaves in 1969, that essentially brings an end to that system. Once he leaves, the system leaves with him. Now, in today's episode, we're going to be focusing on an institutional flaw which was in the monarchy constitution, but Gaddafi failed to resolve this. According to historian Dirk Vandewalle, the monarchy deliberately kept the army small, undertrained, and politically fragmented to prevent a coup. It worked until it didn't. Gaddafi walked into that vacuum and understood the central rule of power. That was the military that brings you power ultimately the military that brings you into power can also remove you. So he built a military designed for one purpose, to protect himself from the military. And for 42 years, it worked. But Libya was not just a regime, it was a rentier oil state inside the Cold War system. We're going to be looking at its rentier systems, the Libya's rentier system, in our very next episode. But we're just touching on it lightly here. Right, so oil revenue replaced taxation, which meant that the regime did not need a bargaining relationship with society to finance itself. So I'm just going to give a rough explanation. A rentier oil state essentially means that most of the money for the state was coming from exporting oil, not from citizens' taxes. Most countries have a situation where their revenue is coming from citizens' taxes, but for Libya, all their revenue came from exporting oil. Right. So let's now talk about what Gaddafi inherited in 1969. There was no unified officer corps, no institutional identity, no national doctrine. Officers were trained abroad and loyalty was personal, not institutional. Again, documented by Vandewalle. Gaddafi's first move was a purge. He learned immediately a weak army is easy to take, but a strong one is dangerous to the ruler. Does that make sense? It's easy to then it's easy to then take power from a country where its army is weak, but it's also dangerous if your army is too strong, because then it might pose as a threat to you as the person who has now taken power. Now let's look at how he designed, essentially he coup-proofed his country. So Florence Gaub describes the Libyan system as a textbook case of coup-proofing, the deliberate fragmentation of the armed forces into parallel organizations with competing chains of command. So what Gaddafi essentially did, he came into power and made sure that he fragmented, that there was no unified army. So there were so many different militia groups. We're gonna look into to how many militia groups at the end. In fact, let me actually pose a question to you. How many militia groups do you think Libya had? I want you to comment and tell me how many you think were the militia groups that were actually there in Libya. I'm interested to know what your guess is going to be. Now, what political scientist Risa shows is that this strategy increases regime survival but reduces military effectiveness. Because if you're fragmenting your entire country into different militia groups, ultimately there's no effectiveness because everyone is pretty much doing their own thing, right? So fragmentation removed the possibility of coordinated coups. There couldn't be a coup because no one was unified, right? So if you had a situation where there was all these militia groups uniting, then it would pose a threat to the system. It also removed the possibility of national defense, as I've pointed to. Right. Now, here's another problem. Hardware without capability. You see, data from International Institute for Strategic Studies shows that by 2011, Libya had tens of thousands of personnel and vast Soviet-era arsenals. But there was no unified command, no joint doctrine, no independent logistics, and no professional officer corps. Hardware existed without institutional capability. What I'm trying to say is that they had all these weapons, but there was no training for a specific army to know how to wield those weapons. So without If you have weapons without the capability, essentially you're not really doing much. The effectiveness becomes very becomes very little. Now let's look at the elite loyalty forces. Now, the U.S. diplomatic cables consistently described the Kamis Brigade. So that was essentially the only army that Gaddafi really trusted to have, you know, he elevated this particular group so that they could have a lot more power. It was an elite regime which was basically loyalty to Muammar Gaddafi. It was led by the son of Muammar Gaddafi, Kamis Gaddafi, right? It was the best possible security structure because listen, if you're going to put your son as the commander of this particular army, that pretty much guarantees that your safety is going to be prioritized in principle, and most likely, in the event that you get removed, at least your son is if you get removed by this particular army, at least your son is the one who's gonna inherit whatever you would have built. Now, the Kamis Brigade was essentially the most reliable military force. It was better trained, better equipped, and directly tied to Gaddafi's family. He had his son there, right? Its function was not national defense, its function was regime protection. So this particular army, out of the several amounts of militia groups, it was given the priority to have all this power, all this military equipment, all this know-how on how to run things, because it was closely linked to Gaddafi and it would ultimately, protect him if anything bad would happen. Now, why the system collapsed? International Crisis Group reporting from 2011 shows that when the uprising began, units defected along personal and regional lines. Eva Bellin's comparative authoritarian, authoritarianism work explains why militaries built on patrimonial loyalty lack the institutional cohesion required for either sustained repression or negotiated transition. Remember, so many militia groups, and I hope you've typed in how many militia groups you think Libya had, because there are a lot, right? So essentially, because there were so many militia groups, some units fought, some defected, most waited. There was no institutional capable of acting as the military. There was no unified military. There was no institution capable of acting as the military, essentially meaning that all these militia groups were just trying to protect their own interests. They could never really be unified to fight for the country. So all these armed forces were deliberately engineered to be incoherent, especially at national level. This wasn't by accident. Remember, the main aim here is to make sure that there's never a situation that you've got a unified army that could possibly remove you from power. Now, remember I asked you to say I want you to have a guess on how many militia groups that were in Libya. Libya had over, are you ready for it? 1,700 armed militia groups, right? So research from the Small Arms Survey and Wolfram Lacquer shows that after the fall of the regime, approximately 1,700 armed groups operated across Libya. This was not post-collapse chaos. Like, this was not, ultimately, we're not saying that these groups formed after the collapse of, these groups formed after the fall of Gaddafi. No, these groups were literally there before the collapse. So it was the continuation of a system that prevented institutional unity for 4 decades. So for 40 years, it was the system constantly dividing the nation into different militia groups, making sure that they can never turn into a unified army. So Gaddafi did not leave a military, he left armed networks. In conclusion, a unified military is dangerous to a personalized regime, but necessary for a durable state. See, Gaddafi solved the first problem, making sure that that there's never a situation where there's a unified army that could possibly remove him from power. He managed to solve that first problem by making sure that there's no coherency within any of these militia groups. However, he made it impossible to solve the second problem, which was to make sure that Libya ends up becoming a durable state. You see, when existential crisis arrived, the institution he had spent over 42 years preventing, which was, preventing a unified army, was the only thing that could have possibly protected him or possibly preserved both the regime and the state. Now, in our next episode, we're going to be looking at the patronage network, the system that financed survival. That's when we're going to be looking at the rentier system, the rentier oil system, which Libya had put in place. I hope to see you guys in the next episode. I'm Jay Chronic. Hope to see you there.